providing sound advice. Another hero I'm sure you know of is Kevin Page, who was our first parliamentary budget officer. Well, yeah, a phenomenal human being. And Kevin Page knew, he was appointed by Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper created the position of parliamentary budget officer. And then didn't give it any budget, didn't give it any power, and didn't think that Kevin Page would do much with it. And when Kevin Page started providing what his mandate was, to provide information to parliamentarians, he was attacked personally. That's another hallmark of what's happening that I think puts Canadian democracy at risk, is the willingness to attack good people who are doing their job, fulfilling their mandate, to attack them personally. It certainly happened to Kevin Page. It happened to Richard Colvin, the diplomat within our foreign service, who under subpoena testified about the Afghan detainee crisis and the question of torture. It certainly has happened to, and right now is happening, perfect at the moment, because I do want to talk about this bill, what's happening to the Chief Electoral Officer, Mark Mayrant, that he's being attacked personally because he's trying to say, which is his job as the top elections officer of the country, the leading expert, appointed not by Liberals, appointed by Harper. He's trying to say, look, what you're proposing in this new law is going to hurt the integrity and the fairness of Canadian elections. And in response, in the Senate just this week, the Minister for Democratic Reform, Pierre Poilievre, attacked Mark Mayrant personally and said he was power hungry. In essence, that's what he said. He wants more powers, he wants more budget. He's a terrible man, bad person. And Sheila Fraser, our former Auditor General, who said much the same thing. They have a harder time attacking Sheila Fraser because of her record, let's face it, as former Auditor General. They can't claim that she's a dupe of the Liberal Party. She kind of brought down the Liberal Party with exposing the sponsorship scandal. So what they do when they're asked about Sheila Fraser, they pretend they haven't heard her name in the question. And they say, we know Elections Canada disagrees with us. We disagree with the agency. And the Prime Minister has they have really clever little phrases that I think are focus group tested. The Prime Minister's is this, he says, Canadians want secret votes, not secret voters, right? And the other one they have is every Canadian thinks it's completely reasonable that someone should have to prove their identity before they vote. Ignoring the major criticisms of this act, which is that it's going to be really difficult for certain segments of society to prove their identity if this law passes as it is, leaves out that why would we be the only democracy in the known universe? Well, I shouldn't exaggerate. We don't know that there's life on anywhere but this planet. So no hyperbole from me. Let's just stick to this planet. Be the only democracy on this planet to decide that choosing the poll supervisors is up to the party that won.
Oh no.
Oh yeah. Okay, and another feature, we don't want them chosen too early, we don't want them trained properly, so that'll be done at the last minute. Another feature, Elections Canada will lose the mandate to do what they did in 2011 of putting out a press release, which was, I know in Saanich Gulf Islands, I'm not sure if it happened in what is now going to be Nanaimo Ladysmith, but in your area, if you heard radio broadcasts through the day, saying if you're getting phone calls at home that are telling you your poll station has changed, don't listen to any such information. Elections Canada is not calling anyone. No poll stations have changed. If you get a call from Elections Canada, it's someone claiming to be from Elections Canada, but it's not. Elections Canada is not calling you, right? So once the reports began to come in of these robocalls and sometimes live calls, I had a friend on Pender who was told they had to vote in Sydney. They were pretty sure that wasn't right? But they started calling and protesting and complaining, and Elections Canada put out this release. Under the new Fair Elections Act, Elections Canada will be prohibited from warning voters if they think something's up. They'll also be prohibited from reporting on any alleged election frauds or malfeasance. They're not allowed to tell people about it. And in future, they will not be able to investigate it either, because they'll take the investigation functions from Elections Canada and put them in the Office of Public Prosecutions, but they won't give the Office of Public Prosecutions the right to demand that political parties provide information or evidence or testify. what else is there in the Fair Elections Act I should mention? Oh yeah, the spending loopholes. The other thing it does is, I mean, I'm sure you all know, I hope you know, Canada's one of the few places, and when I was working on my last book, it was really clear that one of the places where we really still have a system that is something the envy of the world is on election spending. And this is thanks largely to reforms that were brought in under Liberal Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. Canadian political parties are by law prohibited from accepting donations from corporations or any form of large organism or small society. The only kind of legal donations in Canada's elections are from individual people to a maximum, and the maximum was lowered under Stephen Harper, to a maximum of $1,200. This act raises it to $1,500, which doesn't bother me too much. The part about, and then also under our laws, political parties have a cap on what they can spend. Now, the cap of what you're allowed to spend, I'm not telling tales out of school to tell you, is approximately a zillion times more than the amount of money the Green Party will ever have. But the Conservatives have a hard time staying below the spending cap. They spend a lot of money. They're allowed to spend up to $20 million, I think it is, on television advertising and advertising. And they wanted to overspend that. That's why we had the in-out scandal. They realized there's some ridings that are Conservative candidates aren't spending up to their limit in their riding, which is about $80,000 per riding. So there's some candidates, sort of no-hopers, who aren't spending $80,000. What we'll do is we'll give them the check for the window that they've got between what they can afford to spend and the cap, and then they'll send us the check right back, and then that way we can use that money for more ads. And Elections Canada cottoned onto that and said, sorry, you're not allowed to do that. But under the new rules, the loophole they've opened up is to say, during an election campaign, any money spent on fundraising doesn't count on the cap. And that's pretty loosey-goosey. So there's a lot wrong with the Fair Elections Act, but the way in which they're defending it is to attack absolutely every expert who's speaking out against it. And one of the experts, by the way, I mentioned Mark Mayrand, who's our current Chief Electoral Officer for Canada. The former Chief Electoral Officer for British Columbia, Harry Neufeld, is playing something of a starring role in all this. I don't know how many of you have seen Harry Neufeld's role, but Harry Neufeld was asked by Elections Canada, as the former BC Chief Electoral Officer, someone with expertise, to do a report on the 2011 campaign to assess whether we could do a better job ensuring that poll workers knew how to obey the rules and that everything was going okay. Because Harper made voting more difficult first in 2007 when they passed the law that said you had to bring photo ID or other forms of identification, and they got rid of enumeration, which used to be a pretty good way of having a voting list. Anyway, just to finish off on all this, Harry Neufeld's report was very clear that we need, that ideally, honor the fixed election date, and then you can have poll workers brought in by Elections Canada looking for competent people, not associated with a political party. You can see where the advice differed. And that you can have adequate time to train those people. And if you do all that, elections will go more smoothly. And he found quite a high error rate in terms of how addresses were recorded or clerical errors in relation to voting. What Pierre Poilievre did was cite the Neufeld report and claim that this error rate constituted a risk of voter fraud. That this was somehow evidence that a whole bunch of Canadians were disguising themselves as other people and sneaking to more than one poll on election day to vote over and over again for the party of their choice. And Neufeld got in front of the parliamentary committee, I was there when he testified, and he said, I found no evidence of voter fraud. I didn't even hear a report of one instance of anyone complaining of voter fraud. From every poll station across the country, from every scrutineer, from media, from candidates, the only report of voter fraud wasn't of individual Canadians disguising themselves, pretending to be people they weren't. The complaints were of the industrial scale voter fraud in the robocalls. That was the attempt to defraud the voters. But individual Canadians disguising themselves and voting more than once, no reports of that at all, not one. So then we put that to Pierre Poilievre in the House of Commons and said, Mr. Minister, Mr. Neufeld, the author of the report you've been quoting, says his report says nothing about voter fraud. He said, well, I've read the report, Mr. Neufeld is wrong. I know. It's really too bad that more people aren't in the House of Commons on a day-to-day basis so that we would, more laughter would help is what I'm saying. Because sometimes it just defies belief. Today's, or actually it would be yesterday's National Post, if you want to go home and Google the column by Andrew Coyne, In Bizarro World, Do They Even Vote, I think is the title, in which he says, this has gone off the charts crazy. They are attacking every single expert, and it's as though the fact that every single expert disapproves and disagrees with what they're doing is somehow proof that what they're doing is right. And he said, who knows, they may be right, or, and his last line is, they may just be crazy. And this is from a conservative commentator. Okay, so the threats to Canadian democracy come down to one big problem, other than the dysfunctional voting system. The big thing that's changed, the change started in the 1960s, I suppose you could say. But basically, the Canadian Constitution doesn't recognize the existence of political parties. Political parties are not an essential part of Westminster parliamentary democracy, which is our system of government. And what's happened, and it's been a steady trend, is that as political parties get more power, as it begins, and then as within political parties, as the leaders get more power, and then having created the Prime Minister's office in 1970 under Pierre Trudeau, every Prime Minister since has amassed more and more and more powers to something called PMO. My goodness, you'd swear the way people talk about PMO, that it was somehow like the executive branch of the US Constitution, a recognized entity. It's not. Under Lester B. Pearson, the last Prime Minister before Trudeau created PMO, and I talked to his principal secretary, the late Tom Kent, who was a wonderful, wonderful Canadian. Tom Kent said, yeah, under Lester Pearson, the Prime Minister had an office. There's a couple of stenographers and a file clerk. Now it's a $10 million a year partisan operation filled with ruthless, cutthroat psychopaths. I say that not against the conservatives. I want to say this. The ruthless, cutthroat psychopath is a generic description for all political operatives in all the parties because they lose sense of what it's about, which is a better country, protecting future generations, taking care of each other, and they're rewarded for ruthlessness. They're advanced in their careers for partisanship. The more brutal they are, the more they are revered until they, somebody like Dimitri Soudis messing up and trying to get the nomination for his fiancée. But generally speaking, Dimitri Soudis type behavior is perfectly delineated and occurs in the NDP leader's office, in the Liberal leader's office, and it probably would occur in the Green Party if we had any chance of power. So we gotta watch that. I've got a friend, that guy in the pink shirt over there, he's my campaign manager. Given a chance, he has no ruthlessness at all, he's too sweet. Anyway, I do think that what we need in this country, there's two things. That one is giving me a lot of hope right now, is a conservative member of parliament named Michael Chong. And I'd love to see a show of hands. How many have heard of his bill? Good, yay, okay. Michael Chong's bill, Bill 559, calls for real reforms that would be better if it included getting rid of first past the post, but what it does is it removes the requirement under the Elections Act for the leader of the party to sign the nomination for every candidate. That would remove the big stick that leaders use to threaten their candidates and their MPs. I had a private member's bill to do that, and I don't need to put mine forward at all because Michael Chong's bill does a better job. And his bill also restores to Canadian parliamentary democracy what exists in every other Westminster Commonwealth country around the world, which is the sitting parliamentary caucus of every party in England, in Australia, in New Zealand, in India, everywhere around the world that follows Westminster parliamentary democracy, has the power to remove their leader if they don't like the leader. So, yeah. So, that's where, remember Margaret Thatcher never lost an election? She was removed by her own caucus, and John Major stepped into her shoes. Julia Gillard from Australia removed Kevin Rudd, who was Prime Minister for the Labour Party. She replaced him before the election. She got a minority parliament. Actually, the only reason she formed government instead of the Abbott government was that there were enough Australian Greens in the parliament to prop up the Labour Party so that the Conservatives wouldn't get in. Anyway, Julia Gillard served as Prime Minister in a minority parliament, and right before they went back to the polls in Australia, Kevin Rudd came back and did the same to her and replaced her as leader of the Labour Party going into an election. This ability of a caucus to remove a leader is terribly important, because otherwise we're morphing into almost a US-like system as though we directly elect a prime minister, which we don't. And even the US system is, you know, the US system at least has checks and balances, because the Constitution there was drawn up by a bunch of people who were leery of the power hungry. They just deposed King George III through a revolution, so they were kind of worried. Our history and antecedents and ancestors were the loyalists. We thought King George III was a little off his nut, but on the other hand, the monarchy wasn't such a bad idea, and over time, representative democracy could survive in a constitutional monarchy. And I like that. I love that Westminster parliamentary democracy is all about respect for traditions and knowing that it would be wrong, even if it's legal, to shut down Parliament to avoid a vote you're going to lose. It would be wrong, even though it would be legal, to vote. Right? So this business of fighting to understand what we are as a country is reflected well in Michael Chong's bill. It would allow 20% of the sitting caucus of any party to start a leadership review process. It would reduce the power of the leader of a political party, and in doing so, enhance the power of each member of parliament to work for their constituents instead of for that group of aforementioned psychopaths in the back room, who don't ever run for anything, never stand up and speak in front of a crowd, never ask for your support, are never accountable for what they do. Political parties have too much power, and even more so do leaders of political parties have too much power, and even more so does the Prime Minister's office have such an unhealthy degree of power that Canada has ceased to be, at this moment, a real democracy, and more is described as an elected dictatorship. We're not a real dictatorship, but it's an elected dictatorship. And we need to make sure before the next election that these issues of democracy, and I agree with Tom Mulcair on this. Tom Mulcair said yesterday that we must make sure that the Fair Elections Act is the issue before the next election. Well, I think it's got to be broader. It's got to be the Fair Elections Act. It's got to be getting rid of the leader's signature on Elections Canada nomination forms. It's got to be changing our voting system to get rid of first past the post. It's a whole group of public interest measures that revive Canadian democracy and ensure that when Canadians look at the prospect of voting, they do so thinking, I'm going to vote for the change I want. I'm going to vote for what I believe in. I'm going to hold my MP accountable. I'm going to get through my effort in a democracy the kind of government my kids deserve. And that isn't what we are getting right now. But the good news is, the more time I spend in Parliament, the more I'm sure that these dysfunctional elements in our democracy can be fixed. So with that, that's more than enough for me before opening it up to your questions. Thank you so much for being here today. So Jonathan Dickey here, he's